Hello and good evening, everybody. Greetings from Paris. And in today's live stream lecture, I would like to provide you with a basic introduction to the key Lacanian and Žižekian concept of the master signifier. And by means of using some simple and hopefully easy to understand examples, connect the idea of the master signifier to that of the big other. This is part of a longer lecture series that focuses on what Žižek calls the universal exception, or what the French thinker Jacques Rancière referred to as the part of no part. But for the purpose of today's live stream lecture, which will be about 30 minutes in duration, I'd like to simply focus on the master signifier, as it can be really helpful when it comes to understanding Žižek and Lacan's theories. But first of all, let me say hello to everybody joining us from around the world. I'm so grateful to have this community of like-minded thinkers and philosophically inclined enthusiasts. And a special thank you to the patrons who allow me to keep hosting these open access university-style lectures each and every week. If you'd like to become a patron, you can access the complete archives of my ebooks. These are easy and accessible introductions to Lacan, Žižek, and Hegel. In fact, if you'd like to read the complete guide to Žižek ebook volume 1 through 12, you can find them right now on my Patreon. This is an ongoing subscription service, so as a patron, you will receive a new ebook every 3 months that roughly corresponds to these lecture series. But let us begin. So, what is the master signifier, and why is it so important for Lacan? Well, let's begin with a literary example that Lacan takes from Racine, in which we have a character who says that they no longer experience fear. When they're asked why they don't experience fear, they answer by saying that they only fear God. In other words, by means of fearing God, absolutely, they no longer have any particular fears in the real world. In other words, their absolute fear of God has essentially taken away or substituted their particular fears in the world. And here we have a literary example, if you will, of the master signifier. The master signifier is that which erases or papers over the incongruencies, the gap, the dissonances between the particulars, between particular signifiers. In fact, Žižek likes to argue that anti-Semitism functions in a similar way. When somebody comes up with an anti-Semitic trope of a global Zionist plot to control the banks and secret machinations, etc., we have here essentially a stand-in for what is a difficult and complex situation. And yet this figure of the enemy, the anti-Semitic overlord, essentially makes everything else retroactively make sense. This is why Susan Sontag once joked that she wishes she were a conspiracy theorist. After all, then everything in the world would make sense. Which is to say, one way of explaining what a master signifier is that it is an abstract, i.e. not real entity that makes all the real particular signifiers in the world correspond to a central logic. If you will, the master signifier provides a frame, a signifying frame by which we understand the world around us. On a philosophical level, this is also about the relationship between the universal and the particular. We access the particular paradoxically by means of superimposing onto it a universal substance that is nevertheless not fully real, or at least not tangible. For example, in political terms, think about how the Democratic Party in the recent US presidential elections argued that it was protecting democracy. Here we have the abstract concept of democracy, namely not simply the system of legislative and participatory representation that makes up American democracy, but specifically the idea of democracy, that has to be somehow protected by a specific party against a real or imagined foe. Likewise, a newspaper that says that it exists to protect the truth with a capital T essentially is suggesting a master signifier. The reason you support this newspaper is because you identify as being a certain type of usually liberal reader who sees in the reading of said newspaper a defense of civic freedoms and quote unquote the truth. Once again, we have here, therefore, a master signifier, a kind of abstract universal, be it democracy or the truth, that essentially retroactively allows one's own particular identity to fit within a specific type of mold. Now, it's important to note that the goal of psychoanalysis isn't to step out of the master signifier's power, which is to say, for Lacan, it's not about waking up from the big other. Instead, the paradox is that the master signifier and the big other, which I'll explain in a moment, actually frames and structures, if you will, the subjective, phantasmatic investment in one's life world. Therefore, if one is to change one's life world, in fact, if one is to change reality, one has to first change the fantasy. One has to change the master signifier or one's relationship to the big other, so as to actively reconstitute the way in which one accesses one's reality. But I'll return to this in a moment because it is a little bit difficult to understand, certainly the way I'm expressing it. So another key aspect here, at least for Žižek and the Žižekian interpretation of Lacanian psychoanalysis, is that Žižek also relates it to the critique of ideology. And the critique of ideology essentially accomplishes two things. One, it examines, investigates, perhaps even deconstructs the hidden in plain sight, libidinal, i.e. phantasmatic, rationalizations that govern the manner in which you and I access reality as supposedly innate or natural. Which is to say, the critique of ideology looks at the manner in which the universal hegemonic frame, the master signifier, which appears to us as innate or natural, is in fact always the retroactive result of a specific constellation of power, or interests of power, as it were. However, it's important to note that the critique of ideology can't simply succumb to the basic coordinates of another master signifier. For example, let's say you encounter your stereotypical leftist who, when he sees anything in the world that he considers to be suspicious or morally bad, says, well, it's because of capitalism. The somewhat reductive stance by which everything in the world can be explained away because of capitalism is itself an ideological framing device. It's a master signifier. Here, capitalism becomes a stand-in for the very opposite of what it claims to be, namely a critique of ideology. It simply becomes an ideologically superimposed phrase that does the work for you. Instead, the real critique of capitalism, which for Žižek is inherently linked to the critique of ideology, is the process of exposing the, if you will, particular content that lies hidden within the universal as such. Let me give you an example. Think about the principle of tolerance. Tolerance is one of the key aspects of a post-war liberal identity, the idea of a tolerant, multicultural society in which people of differing faiths and traditions and cultures are all equally welcome. But when it comes to tolerance, and this is something that Derrida already wrote about, there's always something slightly suspicious about it. After all, the first question that comes to mind is, who is being tolerated? And who are they being tolerated by? In other words, the very idea of tolerance implies already that there is a hegemonic natural cultural position, usually that which is tied to the national and cultural identity of the host state, that thereby, quote unquote, tolerates the ethnic otherness of those who are either being welcomed into that society or are merely being tolerated. Which is to say, the frame of tolerance, which represents itself as a universal ideal, the mingling of codeterminate identities, is in fact the superimposition of one particular identitarian frame, namely that of the cultural majority, which is retroactively cast as a universal substance. Hence, the critique of ideology, when applied to the idea of tolerance, is to expose how what appears to be a universal ideal, and indeed one that we can aspire to, is in fact one which masks or obfuscates the power and the interests of a particular identity. Now, the secondary question in the critique of tolerance as one aspect of ideology is that it also essentially begets the question, well, what exactly can be tolerated and what cannot? In other words, the idea of tolerance suggests that there is a kind of innate or natural guideline, a kind of schema of that which falls within the parameters of the tolerable and that which cannot be tolerated. And yet, as Chesterton already observed, strictly speaking, tolerance is a paradox. As Chesterton writes, and it's important to note that this is informed by his Christian faith, he says, strictly speaking, we can only truly tolerate that which is intolerable. Now, this appears to be a contradiction in terms. How can we tolerate that which is intolerable? And yet what he's pointing out is that true tolerance isn't simply to admit as acceptable something which we already deem acceptable in advance, perhaps not entirely desirable, but acceptable. This is not true tolerance. This is something which already fits within the parameters of what we find to be acceptable. Instead, for Chesterton, true tolerance thereby would be to admit as possible something which we find to be completely impossible, something which we find intolerable. In fact, he expands this idea according to other universals, once again, universals that are important to the Christian faith. He says, if true tolerance is to tolerate the intolerable, then true forgiveness is thereby to forgive the unforgivable. After all, if you forgive something which is easy to forgive, then it begets the question, is this actually forgiveness? Like, it's pretty easy to forgive somebody a minor slight, but perhaps the true power of forgiveness is to forgive that which appears completely unforgivable. This is true forgiveness. Otherwise, it's simply acceptance. It's simply dismissing something which someone has done. And finally, of course, the ultimate universal of the Christian logic, we have love. Chesterton says, perhaps then, true love is to love the unlovable. Of course, from a contemporary neoliberal biopolitical perspective, the idea of loving that which is unlovable strikes us as deeply alien and perhaps even toxic. Why would we love that which is unlovable? And yet, what Chesterton has in mind is that true love is precisely to go beyond the particular boundaries of what we find acceptable or tolerable or forgivable or even lovable, and to find the lovable even within that which cannot be loved. True love is therefore precisely that universal aspect that transcends the boundary of the particular and which refuses to be reduced to a false universal that simply masks our own subjective stance, our own particular identity. Hence, you can see how for Chesterton, within the Christian logic, if you will, of this kind of universal love, forgiveness, tolerance, we have implicitly the same metaphysical problem that is also raised by, for example, Žižek and Lacan, the relationship of the universal to the particular. Now, before I go back to Lacan and Žižek, I want to briefly say that this question of the universal in relationship to the particular is a distinctly post-metaphysical one, which is to say, as those of you who have followed my lectures before will already guess, it's essentially a question that really comes up for the first time with Hegel. Hegel's idea that essence is appearance qua appearance already suggests the same logic. essence is not that which is antithetical to the particular, to the phenomena. It's that essence must itself appear in the very gap between phenomena as such. And here we can actually see how Žižek makes a distinction, or perhaps a connection, to be precise, between Hegel and Lacan. Lacan's argument about the master signifier is not that the master signifier is in any way a true universal that is somehow superimposed upon particular sets of signifiers. It's that it's the other way around. What is truly universal is precisely the gap between these signifiers as such, the immanent irreducible quality by which a signifier can never be properly in sync with another signifier, save for the superimposition of this empty space, namely the gap between the signifiers as such. And this is why, without wanting to become too abstract about it, the concept of the big other is so important. As you may well know, Lacan stresses that the big other does not exist. And yet, before we think that this means that it lacks potency, it's important to note that it is the other way around. It exists in its potentiality, in its potency, precisely because it exists in a non-place as such. Let me give you an example. One of the key instances of the big other for Lacan is that it relates to enjoyment. In other words, to go back to what I said earlier, the big other is that which structures the particular in its lived existence and gives it access to reality by means of a fantasy. And this fantasy is always related to the subject's desire. Let's say that you start journaling. Let's say that you open up a diary and you start your first entry with, "Dear Diary." This raises the question, who exactly are you writing for? Are you writing for yourself? Are you addressing the diary as if it were an interlocutor? Are you writing for posterity? Are you imagining that someday either you or someone else will pick the diary up and read it? This means that your exchange of ideas, which is strictly speaking for yourself, as most diaries are, nevertheless hinges upon some external idea, a certain universal other, what you might call the big other, that sustains your participation in this symbolic act. In other words, if the objet petit a, the little other, which is essentially the counterpoint to the big other, if the objet petit a is the structure which allows you to keep desiring to write in your journal, is sustained by the big other, then we can see how they exist together. It might even be that you have a schedule that you write in the morning and that you're trying to get to the end of your notebook. In other words, you create an incentive structure by which you can do the thing. And yet, this incentive structure hinges upon an external point of possibility, what you might call the big other. This, therefore, requires a master signifier. And the master signifier can be found in the words dear diary. It's essentially the tautological gap, if you will, between your desire to write into nothingness, into mere space, as it were. But we can think of many other examples as well. For example, think about a parent who does everything for their child. As soon as they have a child, they realize that no matter what they do, it's framed by means of what it means to be a parent, how it might benefit their child. In fact, one of the painful realizations I think a lot of parents undergo is that they can only enjoy something if it is for their child. In fact, as children grow up and become a little bit more estranged, perhaps, from their aging parents, they might marvel at the way in which the parents will continue to do things as if they were doing it for their children. In other words, the master signifier of being a parent over-informs and structures their identity to such a degree that they can no longer imagine what life would be like without doing it for, excuse me, their children. Excuse me. Probably should have grabbed some water. Okay, let's try to get back to the point. This means that the big other essentially is if you will, the psychic, and this is a reduction, of course, but if you will, the psychic materialization or localization of the inherent metaphysical problem of the master signifier. Or to reiterate, if the master signifier is an arbitrary sign that retroactively appears to tie all the other signs together, for example, protecting democracy becomes how we understand our civic engagement, or protecting the truth becomes how we understand our vocation to read journalism, etc., or rooting out anti-Semitic foes being the right-wing sort of ideology of why everything in the world makes sense. It's a Zionist plot, etc. If the master signifier is therefore the arbitrary sign that obfuscates or appears to eliminate the gap between the signifiers that simply float in the world, particular reality, and the fantasy through which we attach ourselves to them, then the big other is the phantasmatic or libidinal space that essentially allows us to materialize this stance. We access enjoyment by means of doing it for the big other. And accessing enjoyment is how we sustain the phantasmatic frame that allows us to keep participating within the reality that is structured by this master signifier. And the critique of ideology is therefore the critique of the manner in which this reality is superstructured, if you will, or overdetermined by a phantasmatic frame, a master signifier, a universal, which nevertheless hides behind it the very particular agency of a particular group's interests. And of course, the leap to be made here, which you may have already anticipated, is the leap towards the critique of bourgeois ideology, which was key for Marx. Marx's critique of bourgeois ideology, to simplify it somewhat, is that the interests of the bourgeoisie come to appear as the interests of all. In fact, as the innate interests of man, to exist in competition with each other for certain resources and commodities that can be traded, to emphasize quality over quantity, hard work and labor over idleness, etc. It's the culturalization, if you will, which is to say, the process by which we create normative value structures that structure the manner in which we qualify a life. The process by which this occurs becomes overdetermined by what are essentially economic class interests, namely that of the bourgeoisie. Hence, for Marx, the critique of ideology is also the critique of the specific life worlds, namely that of the emerging bourgeois class. And once again, we can actually see here the relationship between Marx and Hegel. Hegel's basic observation is that metaphysics isn't simply this transcendental, detached operation in which we contemplate the ideal or the divine. Instead, Hegel's basic observation, as I talked about in last week's lecture, the fundamental lesson of Hegel, is that the central ontological question isn't that of the universal or the transcendental, but precisely that of the universal or the transcendental making itself manifest in what appears to be its opposite, namely particular phenomena. Not being versus becoming, but being as the essence of becoming as such. Hence, Marx's supposed materialization of Hegel essentially uses this to stage a critique of political economy and the process by which the universal zeitgeist, if you will, makes itself manifest and thereby interpretable, or something that we can critique or read as a kind of text, through the relationship that exists between men, and that for Marx mirrors the relationship between commodities, the famous commodity fetish. Now, I've introduced a lot of different things here, so please note that this is all part of a broader lecture series, which focuses on the relationship between the universal and the particular, and what essentially are the political consequences of this. Because one of my central arguments, and not just my argument, but how I'm trying to help you understand Žižek's arguments and many arguments of his contemporaries, including, for example, Althusser and Chantal Mouffe, etc., is that the critique of ideology and the, if you will, philosophical contemplation of the political is a continuation of metaphysics. It's not simply that after Hegel we enter into a post-metaphysical world in which suddenly Marxism means the culturalization of, if you will, philosophy, the philosophy of X, the philosophy of struggle or revolution or resistance, etc. Instead, it is that the only way to continue metaphysical investigations after Hegel's massive disruption of the central axis or coordinates of the metaphysical operation, namely how to leave the cave and enter into the world of truth, essentially becomes an investigation into the cave as such. Which is to say, to simplify hugely, the post-Hegelian question is, what if the very desire to leave the cave is itself the fantasy that is staged within the cave? What if the very transcendental operation by which we supposedly are able to leave the phenomena behind and enter into the world of the pure noumenon is itself a phenomenon, itself a kind of spectral illusion or a lie? And this isn't a relativism, I think. This isn't a pessimism. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Hegel's philosophy is a distinctly and deeply optimistic one. In fact, I think one could contrast Kant's pessimism, which leads him into a sort of, if you will, pessimistic idealism, the things in themselves which cannot be known but which must nevertheless exist, is contrasted with Hegel's innate dialectical optimism. Indeed, you might even call it dialectical exuberance. The possibility that man might come to know the structural conditions as to the unfolding of his very being against the backdrop of the essential becoming of history. And this exuberance, this optimism, the idea of a science of philosophy that therefore merges the Enlightenment spirit with the metaphysical inquiry, is continued into Marxism. Hence why Marxism presents itself both as a philosophy and as a science of philosophy, if you will. And of course, from a pre-Hegelian perspective, these tendencies seem to be antithetical. How can it be both a science, which from an Aristotelian perspective is the inquiry into that which can be measured and seen, but also a metaphysics, namely the inquiry into that which cannot be seen? And yet, starting with Kant, whose critique of pure reason is essentially a Humean, i.e. critical investigation or skeptical investigation into the coordinates of traditional metaphysics, starting with Kant, we essentially have the opening up of a door through which Hegel runs. And Hegel runs through this open door, essentially, with a kind of gleeful optimism, the optimism of spirit. And hence, to return to my point, any inquiry into the critique of ideology, into contemporary political constellations, is therefore not just a refutation of traditional metaphysics, but indeed a continuation of it by other means. And so to understand Hegel's relationship to Kant, I think can also help us understand why it is still possible to practice philosophy, why it is still possible to be a philosopher in what appear to be distinctly unphilosophical times. To me, this is a very hopeful thought, and perhaps it will also be thus for you. This has been a short lecture introducing the basic parameters of the Lacanian psychoanalytic concept of the master signifier, how it relates to the critique of ideology according to Slavoj Žižek, the notion of the big other, Chesterton's universal Christian logic of forgiveness, tolerance, love, but also a statement, if you will, an argument, a mission statement as to the philosophical exuberance of the Hegelian metaphysical inquiry and how it can still animate us today. Thank you so much. It has been my true pleasure to share this time with you. I hope it's been instructive. And if you'd like to learn more, please do consider becoming a patron, where you can download my ebook introductions to Hegel, Lacan, and Žižek. I will see you next week. Bye-bye.